Back in the fall of 2016, I was 38 and had been working seasonal park jobs for almost 10 years. That year, I got posted to a small state park in northern Idaho, about 40 miles from the nearest town, mostly pine forest, high ridgelines, a few deep lakes, and a stretch of old logging road that barely showed up on GPS. Most visitors didn't come past the main campground, which was closer to the highway, but my post was deeper into the woods, near an old ranger's outpost that hadn't been used regularly in decades. They called it Cold Pines. It had been part of a forest fire watch area during the 70s, then mostly forgotten. There were a few trails leading out from there, but most weren't marked anymore. Just overgrown paths winding out into nowhere. I had a 4x4 truck, a radio, and enough supplies for a week at a time. The job was to do basic maintenance, check for squatters, monitor wildlife activity, and stay in touch with the main office back near the visitor center. That cabin was about 20 feet wide and maybe 30 deep. It had a small generator shed out back and a water tank that collected rainwater from the roof. Inside there was a single bunk, a desk with old maps pinned above it, shelves full of dusty books and field guides, and a small wood stove in the corner.
No ens elasten.
The walls were thin and cold even during the day. The windows were high and narrow and covered in wire mesh. The floor creaked with every step. The first week went quietly. Just me, the trees, and the kind of silence you only get far from people. I'd go on patrol early in the morning, sometimes hike up one of the old trails and watch for animal signs or campers gone off trail. But nobody ever came this far in. I'd log my reports every evening, mark the weather, and radio in once a day. Everything felt normal. Then, around the middle of my second week, I started noticing small things that felt off. It started with the trail markers. Out on the west side trail, which didn't even show up on the maps anymore, I found a fresh blaze on a tree, a bright white mark cut clean into the bark. It looked fresh, like someone had been through in the last day or two. I stood there looking at it for a long time. The state hadn't sent anyone else into the area, and there were no crews scheduled. I marked it in my notebook, took a picture on my phone, and kept going. 10 minutes later, I found another, then another, almost as if someone had been marking a route in reverse, back toward the cabin. That night, I sat on the bunk reading a field manual by headlamp when I heard movement out behind the cabin. At first, it was just the sound of branches cracking. Could have been a moose, maybe a deer. I stood still, waited, then turned off the headlamp. Everything went dark. I listened. A branch snapped again, closer this time. I walked quietly to the back window, but I couldn't see anything through the mesh screen and glare. I stepped outside with the flashlight and swept the beam across the trees. Nothing, just the cold air and tall shadows. But I kept thinking about those blazes on the trees. Something didn't sit right with me. I left the outside light on when I came back in and kept my boots by the bed just in case. By the third week, I knew for sure someone else had been in the woods. I found footprints. It was about 6 in the morning and I'd hiked out to the dry creek east of the cabin to check a game camera I'd put up. The ground there was mostly sand and small stones. Not the best for prints, but I saw them plain as day, heel-to-toe impressions going toward the trees. Not boots, not hiking shoes. They looked like worn-down sneakers. One of the shoes had a tear near the front. There were only a few prints, but I followed them as far as I could. They went straight into the trees and vanished. No signs of a campsite, no food wrappers, no fire pit, just the prints. Later that night, I stayed up late going over the camera footage. Nothing strange showed up. A fox, some squirrels, a blurry elk that passed through during the day. But I couldn't get those prints out of my head. Who would come all the way out here in shoes like that and leave no sign of staying? I marked the location and made a note in the daily report. I didn't sleep much that night. It was cold, and I kept thinking I heard movement. I'd shut the generator down like I always did after sunset, and the cabin was dead silent. Every time the wind picked up and the trees rubbed against the sides, I'd bolt upright and grab the flashlight. Nothing was there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was moving just past the line of trees behind the cabin. Not animals, not wind, someone walking and stopping. By the end of the 4th week, I started finding trash. At first, it was a crushed energy drink can near the generator shed. Then, a few days later, a torn piece of foil wrapper wedged into a tree root. It was too recent to be from the old days, and it wasn't mine. I kept a plastic tub for all my trash and hauled it out on supply runs. I didn't just toss things. One night, I woke up to a soft scraping sound outside the cabin. Not an animal pawing, longer, slower, like something dragging lightly across the outer wall. I laid still and listened. It lasted maybe 20 seconds. Then it stopped. I didn't move. I waited an hour before I even sat up. I didn't hear footsteps, no running, no vehicle, just that slow, faint scraping. I checked around the cabin first light. There was a faint scuff mark under one of the windows, near the ground, almost like someone had brushed something across it, maybe a branch or stick. But I didn't see any nearby. I thought about calling it in, but what would I say? I wasn't seeing a crime, just strange things, and I still had a week left on my post. Then, on a foggy morning, I saw a light. I'd gone out early to hike a higher ridge and watch for signs of weather. On the way down, I looked across the trees and saw a glint of light, quick, like a reflection. At first, I thought it was sunlight hitting something metal, but it was overcast. The light flickered again, a narrow beam, maybe a flashlight. It moved once, then vanished. I stared into the trees for 10 minutes, didn't see anything else. I made my way back to the cabin slowly, always glancing behind me. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter and found the same white tree blaze I'd seen weeks ago, but this time on a tree only 30 yards from the cabin. I hadn't seen it before. It was new, fresh, the bark still curling at the edges. That night I didn't sleep. Around 3 in the morning, the motion sensor light outside flicked on. I froze in bed, heart pounding. The light only went off if something came within 15 feet of the back door. I waited.
No footsteps, no sounds.
Just the pale glow of the bulb through the cracks in the wood. I reached over slowly, pulled on my boots without tying them, grabbed the flashlight and the small revolver I kept in the lockbox. I moved to the door and pressed my ear to it. I heard breathing, not mine, low, shaky, shallow. I stood frozen for almost a minute, hand on the latch. Then, without warning, the light clicked off again. I waited another 10 minutes before opening the door an inch and shining the light out. There was nothing, but I saw the prints again. Those same worn sneakers, clearer this time. They led from the trees to the back door, then turned and went back. I followed them until they vanished in the brush. The next morning, I tried the radio. Static. I tried the backup hand unit. Just a low hum. The signal tower must have gone out. It hadn't rained, so I figured something else knocked it out. Maybe a fallen tree. I had no way to report in. I decided to cut my post short. I packed everything I could carry into the truck and locked up the cabin. I didn't have time to clean. I just wanted to get back to the main station. It was about an hour's drive if the road stayed clear. About 15 minutes in, I rounded a bend and slammed the brakes. Someone had dragged a fallen log across the trail. It wasn't natural. The bark had fresh cuts, probably from a hatchet or saw, and it was placed deliberately at an angle, like it had been meant to slow someone down. I got out, heart thudding. I moved the log enough to drive past, but I kept scanning the trees. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything. But I drove the rest of the way with one hand on the wheel and the other near the gun on the passenger seat. When I got back to the main station, I found out the tower had gone down 2 days earlier, lightning strike. I made a full report about the prints, the trash, the marks, and the incident with the back door. They sent a search team out a few days later. They didn't find anything.
No squatters. No camps.
No one on the trail cameras. The woods were empty, but when they checked the cabin, one of the crew found something. Under the bunk, tucked deep behind the firewood pile, someone had left a torn strip of denim fabric. It looked like it had been ripped from a pant leg. Stained. Faint traces of blood along one edge. That wasn't there when I'd first moved in. They sealed it in a bag, but I never heard if they followed up. That was my last season as a ranger. I left the job after that and moved back to Oregon to work for a small wildlife rehab center. I don't go into deep woods anymore. Not alone. Not without a working radio and a group. And I still think about that breath on the other side of the door. Whoever it was had come all the way out there. They didn't light fires. They didn't make noise. They marked the trees. They watched from the edge of the forest. And they came back. Every night. Closer than the night before. I wasn't supposed to be there. The cabin belonged to my cousin, Ray, but he'd moved to Oregon 3 years back and hadn't visited since. He gave me the keys the previous winter when I told him I needed time away from everything. Divorce, job loss, depression. I had my reasons. He said, "Go up there as long as you need. No one uses it anymore." That's all I needed. No people, no phones, no city noise. Just trees, wind, and the quiet. It was early November, 2022. Idaho had already begun showing signs of winter. I drove from Boise early in the morning in my '07 Ford Ranger with my dog, a German Shepherd mix named Cody, riding shotgun. It was a 5-hour drive to the edge of Clearwater National Forest. Then 2 hours more down a dirt road that felt like it had never seen gravel. That truck was barely holding together. The trees got thicker the deeper we went. No traffic, no lights, no sounds but the wind. The cabin sat on a slope above a narrow stream, tucked away under heavy pine cover. It looked rough. Logs had darkened with age. The porch was sagging, and the windows were dirty with streaks of moss. The old propane tank out back was still there, rusted but intact. Ray had told me it worked, barely. A metal chimney stuck out of the side. Ray had added a stove for heat. I parked in the patch of flattened weeds that served as the driveway, killed the engine, and just sat there for a moment. Cody sniffed the air. His ears perked. He didn't growl or bark, but something made him pause. "Come on," I muttered to myself. "It's just a cabin." I hauled out supplies, mostly canned food, rice, oats, dry dog food, firewood, and enough water to get by for at least 2 weeks. I had a rifle and a .45 in my bag, both loaded. Not because I expected trouble, but because Ray had told me the same thing 3 times before I came. You're alone out there. Animals don't care, you need peace and quiet. The first 2 days were quiet. I cleaned the place up, mopped the floor with lake water and bleach, scraped out a mouse nest from the stove, fixed the door hinge, and cleared dead branches off the roof. Cody sniffed around, sometimes wandered up the trail behind the cabin, but always stayed close. I didn't see anyone or hear anything besides whine through the trees and the occasional coyote howl at night. I felt something change the 3rd night. It started with Cody. I was sitting on the porch in an old folding chair, watching the trees as dusk settled in. The light fell quick out there. By 6, it was black. That night, Cody got up from the porch and trotted about 15 feet into the trees. He stood still, staring into the brush.
No talback, no passing.
Just still. Then his ears went down and his tail tucked. He backed up slowly until he was under the porch. Not a sound out of him. I walked to the edge of the porch and looked out. Nothing. I couldn't see past the tree trunks. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I woke up to find boot prints in the dirt. Not mine. The path down to the stream behind the cabin was mostly loose soil and dead leaves, but it caught prints well. About 40 feet from the cabin, the trail split. One led to the stream, the other curved up toward a ridge. I always went to the stream, but that morning I noticed something in the soil. Tracks. They were human, but not fresh, maybe a few hours old. I followed them up the ridge. About 100 feet up, they just stopped. No more footprints, just vanished. I stood there for a while, listening. Cody didn't follow me up. He stayed by the cabin, pacing in a circle. That afternoon, I did a full check around the perimeter. Nothing else looked off. The door was locked, my food was untouched, and I didn't see any gear left behind. No wrappers, no tire marks, no smell of smoke in the air. Just those boot prints, stopping mid-trail like someone vanished into the trees. That night, I set up a motion alarm near the trail. Ray had a bunch of old camping stuff stashed in a bin under the porch. Some of it was junk, but the motion sensor worked. It was one of those cheap kinds that beeped if anything crossed its field. I also put up a small bell near the back window. Paranoid? Yeah, probably. But something didn't feel right. At 3:12 a.m., the alarm went off. A sharp beep beep beep, just once, then silence. Cody growled low from the floor next to the cot. I sat up fast, heart pounding, grabbed the rifle, and crept toward the door. I didn't turn on any lights. I opened the door slowly, careful not to let it creak. Stepped out barefoot onto the porch. It was cold. The air felt thicker, like fog without fog. But I didn't see anything. Then I heard it. Crunch. Leaves. About 20 feet away, just out of the porch light's range. Not heavy like someone walking, more like shifting weight from one foot to another. I raised the rifle and just stood there, waiting, listening. No more sounds. After 10 minutes, I went back inside and stayed up till morning. I disabled the alarm. Something felt off about it all. Like if they knew I had it, it would just escalate. That day, I went hunting, not because I needed food, but because I wanted to feel normal. I hiked further up the ridge, following a dry stream bed deeper into the forest. Around midday, I stopped to eat. Cody sat beside me, eyes on the trees. That's when I saw it. About 70 feet to my right, just beyond the tree line, a shape. It was low to the ground, not crouching but not walking either, like someone on all fours, but with long limbs. Too long. It moved slow behind the trees. I froze. Cody didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just stared. Then it was gone. I hiked back fast. I kept my rifle up the whole time. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow between the trees looked like it was moving. I didn't go out the next day. That night, I stayed awake on purpose. I kept the fire going, checked the locks twice, and sat in the chair with the rifle across my lap. Cody didn't sleep. He stayed by the front door, ears twitching at every gust of wind. At 2:44 a.m., I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching leaves, getting closer. I didn't move. I didn't blink. Then silence. Then tapping on the window. Not knocking, tapping. Fingernails soft. 2 taps. Then 3 more. Then nothing. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. Eventually, the sun came up. When I went out, there were no tracks in the frost. None. The leaves looked undisturbed. The bell I had tied near the window was still hanging. I didn't understand it. I was losing sleep, losing sense of time. I started hearing things during the day, cracking branches when the air was still, faint breathing when no one was near. Once, I swore I heard someone whisper my name, but it was my own voice echoing in my head. On the 7th day, I found the deer. It was about 30 yards from the cabin, down by the stream. His body was torn open, but not eaten. Guts still there, just ripped wide. The head was turned backward unnaturally, like it had been twisted. Not chewed, twisted. Clean. No blood trail.
No prints.
Just the deer. Cody wouldn't go near it. He circled wide and whimpered. I buried it under rocks and dirt, but something in me knew that wasn't going to change anything. That thing, whatever it was, wasn't hungry. It wasn't hunting. It was warning me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with both guns next to me. Cody curled tight in the corner, eyes fixed on the window. Around 1:50 a.m., I heard breathing. Outside the cabin. Deep, steady, controlled. I grabbed the rifle and crept toward the door. I didn't open it. I just stood there, listening, my hand shaking on the doorknob. Then I heard footsteps on the porch. Heavy, but uneven, like dragging a leg. Or, no, like someone walking on 2 feet but not used to walking like that. Then the doorknob moved. Slowly. I didn't breathe. I kept the rifle up, finger on the trigger, but I didn't open the door. After 30 seconds, the footsteps backed off. I waited 2 hours before stepping outside. Nothing.
No marks.
No tracks. No sound. I'd had enough. By dawn, I packed everything. I loaded the truck, slammed the tailgate shut, and was ready to drive out when I noticed something carved into the wooden post near the stairs. 3 deep, parallel slashes. 2 even for claws. 2 deep for a knife. I didn't look back. The drive down that road was the longest of my life. Every tree trunk looked like it had eyes. Every time Cody looked out the window, I braced for something to come out of the woods. I stayed in a motel in Orofino that night. Locked the door. Didn't sleep. Didn't turn off the light. Ray called me a few days later. He asked how it went. I just told him the place needed work. I didn't mention the deer, the sounds, the shape in the woods. He paused, then said something I still think about. Yeah, it was never real quiet up there. Never felt right to me. That was it. I never went back. It was the spring of 2014 when I decided to take a break from the city. I was 29 then, working long hours at a trucking warehouse in Kansas City. My back ached all the time, and my sleep had been trash for months. I was getting headaches, and my hands had started to shake from too much coffee and not enough rest. I remember one morning when I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. Pale skin, red eyes, hair greasy even after I washed it. I needed to get out. A guy at work named Mike told me about a cabin that belonged to his uncle. Said it sat at the edge of an old soybean farm up in Iowa. His uncle wasn't using it anymore since he moved to Florida, and the place just sat there locked up. It was small, had no Wi-Fi, no cable, no cell signal. Perfect. I asked him if I could borrow it for a few weeks, and he made a call. 2 days later, I was packing the truck. The drive was quiet. I left before sunrise and took back roads most of the way. Passed by a few small towns I'd never heard of. Places with names like Harmony Ridge, Twin Falls, and Red Oak Hollow. By mid-afternoon, I was pulling down a long dirt road that led to the cabin. Dust flew up behind the truck in thick clouds, and for a while, I couldn't even see what I was heading into. The land was flat and wide, with bare fields stretching out in every direction. Most of the fields looked like they hadn't been worked in a while. Some had weeds growing waist-high. Others had rows of old crops, browned and broken, like the last harvest had been left to rot. The whole place felt abandoned. I didn't see a single house or person for miles. The cabin sat at the far edge of the property, near a tree line that marked the beginning of a wooded area. It looked older than I expected. The wood was gray and dried out, the roof patched with sheets of tin in some places. A rusted wind vane on the chimney squeaked in the breeze, and the front steps sagged in the middle. But it was standing, and it had 4 walls and a roof. That was enough for me. Inside, it was simple. 1 room with a bed, a small table, a wood stove, and a counter with an old sink.
No plumbing.
A well pump sat out back, and the outhouse was about 50 yards off into the trees. There was a dusty pantry with a few cans of soup and beans, some crackers, and jars of what looked like pickled vegetables. I brought my own food, so I didn't touch any of it. The first night was peaceful. I made a small fire in the stove, opened a can of stew, and sat at the table watching the last bit of sunlight fade through the tiny window. No traffic.
No sirens. No phones.
Just quiet. I slept better that night than I had in months. I woke up early the next morning, just after 5. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows across the fields. I stretched, washed my face with cold water from the pump, and went for a walk along the edge of the tree line. The birds were chirping, and the wind rustled through the dry grass. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe. I spent most of that first week doing nothing. Reading, writing in a little notebook I brought, walking the property. There were old farming tools scattered around. Rusted plows, broken carts, a collapsed barn about 100 yards from the cabin. I didn't go into the barn. It looked like it could fall in any minute, and I wasn't in the mood to get crushed by old timber. But as the days passed, I started noticing little things. First, it was the tracks. On the third morning, I found fresh footprints in the dirt near the back of the cabin. Not boot prints, bare feet. Wide ones, bigger than mine. The ground was soft from a light rain the night before, and I could see them clearly. 5 toes, deep heel impressions. Someone had been walking behind the cabin sometime in the night. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a drifter or a hunter, but it still made me uneasy. I checked the cabin, made sure the doors were locked, and kept a pocket knife on me for the rest of the day. The next day, I found a dead rabbit on the front step. His neck had been twisted, not chewed. There was no blood. It looked almost placed there, like a gift or a warning. I buried it behind the cabin, trying not to overthink it. Maybe a fox dropped it. Maybe a hawk. Weird things happen in the country. By the end of the second week, I was sleeping with the knife under my pillow. I started hearing noises at night. Light footsteps outside the cabin, crunching grass, the sound of movement just past the window. Once, around 3 in the morning, I heard something scrape along the side of the wall. Not a branch or wind. It was slow, steady, like someone dragging a stick or a finger along the wood. I got up and looked out, but there was nothing, just darkness and wind. I didn't go back to sleep that night. One afternoon, I hiked out past the woods behind the cabin. I wanted to get a better sense of the land. After about an hour of walking, I came across a barbed wire fence. It was half knocked down, with an old wooden post leaning at an angle. Beyond it was another field, and in the middle of that field, I saw a second cabin, smaller than the one I was staying in.
No roof.
Half the walls caved in. I climbed through the fence and walked over. The air around that place felt different. Still, too still. Even the birds were quiet. Inside the ruined cabin, there was a broken table, a few rotted blankets, and a pile of small bones in the corner. I don't know what animal they came from, but they looked burned. As I turned to leave, I saw something that made my stomach twist. Nailed to the inside of the door was a row of old Polaroid photos. Most were sun-faded, but I could still make out the shapes. People standing in the woods, people sleeping. One photo showed a man standing at the edge of the field at night. Another showed a cabin, my cabin, taken from outside the window. The photo was old, but the curtains were the same. I left fast, walked back to my place without stopping once. That night, I didn't light a fire. I stayed in the dark, listening. Around midnight, I heard movement again, this time closer, slower, then a soft tapping on the window, just once, then again. I sat on the bed, knife in hand, breathing through my nose to keep quiet. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The tapping stopped after a few minutes, then silence, but the feeling didn't leave. I knew someone had been out there. The next morning I checked the ground. No footprints this time, but the front door handle had fresh smudges on it, like oily fingerprints. And in the dirt near the steps, I found something I didn't expect. An old key, rusted, thin, with a small tag attached to it that read, "Shed." There was no shed, at least not one I'd seen. I spent the day walking the property, trying to find anything I'd missed. Late in the afternoon, behind the collapsed barn, I saw what looked like a trapdoor half covered in dead leaves. I cleared it off. There was a padlock on the handle, but it was rusted through. I pried it off with a rock and opened the door. Stairs led down into the dark. I didn't have a flashlight, so I used the flashlight on my phone. The battery was low, but it was enough to see. The space underneath was small, maybe 8 by 10 feet. Dirt walls, wooden beams holding the ceiling. In the corner was a mattress, stained and torn. Pile of empty cans. A metal bucket. Someone had been living down there. I backed out, shut the trapdoor, and put heavy stones on top of it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the table with the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. Every sound made my skin crawl. Every creak of the walls, every gust of wind. I kept waiting for the tapping to come back, but it didn't. In the morning, I packed up, threw everything in the truck. I didn't clean, didn't fold the blankets, didn't lock the cabin. I just got in and left. About 20 minutes down the dirt road, I passed a man walking along the edge of the field. He was barefoot. His jeans were soaked from the knee down, and his hands were dark with dirt. He didn't look at me, just kept walking toward the cabin. I didn't stop. I got back to Kansas City before sunset. Went straight to Mike at work and told him about what I saw. He just stared at me, not saying anything. Then he said his uncle had told him not to go past the tree line. I asked why, and he said, "I don't know. He just said not to. Said someone else used to live out there." I never went back. That week, I changed my phone number and moved to a different apartment on the other side of town. For a long time, I'd jump at every sound at night, every knock on the wall. I kept a knife beside my bed, even though I knew it wouldn't matter. It's been years now, but I still don't sleep with the window open. I still check the locks twice, and sometimes I dream I'm back in that cabin, with nothing but silence outside, and something standing just past the window waiting. I was 61 years old when I finally took the trip. It was the spring of 2019, and I had just retired from a quiet security consultant job in Aberdeen, Washington. Before that, I had spent over 2 decades working under various government contracts, some clean, some not. You get older, your bones start to ache, and your mind starts to drift back to places you tried to forget. I guess that's why I went back. The cabin wasn't mine, not legally anyway. It was my uncle's, a man named Robert Carlyle. He died in 2002, and the land sat untouched ever since. Deep inside Flathead National Forest in Montana, the place was hard to find even when you were trying. It had no paved road, no cell coverage, and was marked on no map I've ever seen. If you didn't know it was there, you'd walk right past it, or never get close at all. Back in the 80s, before I left for my first long overseas assignment, I spent a summer helping Uncle Robert build that place. He didn't trust contractors, said they brought too much noise with them. He wanted it quiet, simple, and hidden. We dug out the perimeter by hand, laid every log with sweat and rope, nailed the tin roof down in the rain, and chopped our own firewood every day. He had rules, no cameras, no phones, no records. Even then, something about that land felt like it didn't want to be disturbed. I don't know what finally made me decide to go back. I hadn't thought about that place in years. Then one morning, I just woke up and packed a bag. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe just stubborn nostalgia. Whatever it was, I loaded up my old Chevy Suburban, stocked it with tools, supplies, a chainsaw, a rifle, and some old paper maps, and started the 12-hour drive east. Montana hit me like a cold splash of memory. Once you get past the cities and the tourist crap, it's endless woods and mountains, the kind that never stop reminding you how small you are. I reached the edge of Flathead around noon the next day, parked off an unmarked dirt trail, locked the truck, and set off with my gear. The hike was rougher than I remembered. What used to take me 2 hours now took nearly 5. My knees hated every incline, and I had to stop more than I wanted to. The trail had overgrown almost completely. Trees had fallen over parts of it. But when I finally caught sight of the cabin, sitting low in the shadows of the pines, it looked almost untouched. Everything was where it should have been. The roof had held. The door still swung on its hinges. The small stone chimney hadn't collapsed. The wood was dry and solid, though a bit sun-bleached. The porch creaked the same way it always had. Inside was thick with dust and cobwebs, but it was all still there. The old iron stove, the narrow cot, the trunk of supplies, and the heavy workbench in the corner. I swept the place out and sat down. For a long while, I just stared out the window at the woods. I didn't feel peace. I didn't feel fear either. I felt something in between, like the forest had paused, waiting to see what I was going to do. I stayed 3 nights. The first day was mostly cleaning and fixing. I chopped firewood until my hands cramped. I patched up the side wall where some bark had rotted out. The second day, I cleared the trail from the cabin to the stream, a narrow, rocky cut about half a mile downhill. It used to be the only water source. That night, the wind picked up and didn't stop. The trees groaned and swayed like they were trying to warn me. At one point, I heard something sharp echo through the dark. Not a howl, not a scream, more like a long, broken cough, far off, deep in the woods. I sat still in the cabin, hand on my rifle, but nothing came. The third day, I went looking for the old hunting stand we'd built on a ridge just past the creek. It had been over 30 years, and I didn't expect to find anything. But I did. Or rather, I found what was left of it. Just 2 upright beams and part of the wooden seat, half rotted and tilted. I climbed the ridge and looked down at the trees. The valley below was thick, dark, and still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving down there, just out of sight. But when I looked again, it was all quiet. That night, I didn't sleep much. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps outside. Not animals, not wind. Footsteps, soft, slow, and circling the cabin. I killed the lantern, picked up the rifle, and stood near the back window. I couldn't see anything, but I waited. The steps didn't come again, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. On the 4th morning, I made a mistake. I decided to follow the sound. Not that exact sound from the night before, but a different one. A steady thumping, like someone hitting a log with a mallet. It came from the ridge behind the cabin, the side we never cleared. The trees were thick there, pine and spruce packed shoulder to shoulder, the forest floor coated with moss and animal scat. I hiked toward the sound for maybe 40 minutes. The deeper I went, the more the air changed. It got colder. The light dimmed, even though the sky was clear. I marked my path with small orange strips of cloth tied to low branches, the way I was trained. After a while, I came to a small clearing, and there, in the middle of it, was a second cabin. It looked old, very old, rougher than my uncle's. The walls were gray with age, roof sagging, door barely hanging. No signs of use.
No smoke.
No path to or from. I stood there for a long time, unsure if I was looking at something forgotten or something hidden. I should have turned around right then, but I didn't. I stepped closer. The door was cracked open. Inside, it smelled like dry rot and earth. Dust danced in the slant of light. There was a cot, a rusted stove, and a table covered with small bones. Animal bones, I thought at first, but some were too long, too straight. One of them looked like a hand. I stepped back and nearly tripped. That's when I saw the chain, half buried in dirt, leading from a post inside the cabin to somewhere under the floor. I didn't check further. I backed out, walked straight to the marker cloths, and followed my trail back. It was late afternoon when I made it to my own cabin. I sat on the porch until dark. That night, I barred the door and kept the rifle close. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I packed. Leaving wasn't easy. It had rained overnight, and the trail was soft, muddy, and slick. I was 2 hours out when I noticed the orange cloths I'd used as trail markers were gone. Every single one of them, gone. I stood there, turning slowly in place, trying to match the trees, the rocks, anything familiar. But the forest didn't look the same. I tried to retrace by memory, but after 30 minutes, I realized I'd made a loop. Panic is a slow thing when you're old and trained, but it still comes. I sat down, drank water, and waited for my pulse to drop. I checked the sun, took out my compass, and guessed a direction that should have taken me west. I started walking again. By late afternoon, I stumbled into a dry creek I didn't recognize. I kept walking. The sun dropped below the ridge. I had no choice but to make a cold camp. No fire, just my tarp and my jacket. I didn't sleep. In the night, I heard voices. Not real voices, not actual words, but the rhythm of human speech. Low and slow, far away and wrong. I stayed frozen under my tarp, gripping my rifle, and waited. The voices came and went. In the morning, I was too stiff to stand up straight. I walked until I couldn't anymore. Then I saw it, my cabin. But something was different. The front door was open. I never left it like that. I approached slowly. The inside had been touched. Not ransacked, just wrong. The cot was moved. The stove door was open. My backpack had been unzipped and zipped again. Nothing taken. Nothing destroyed. Just touched. I backed out of the cabin and decided to leave everything behind. I kept only my map, rifle, canteen, and knife. I left the pack, food, everything else. I made a straight line west, ignoring the old trails, cutting through brush and thorn until finally, after nearly a day and a half, I hit a gravel road. I flagged down a logging truck around noon. The driver didn't say much. He dropped me at a ranger station near Hungry Horse, and I paid a man to take me back to my truck. When I got in, my hands shook. I didn't report anything. There was nothing to report. No crime, no threat, just old bones, broken cabins, and missing trail markers. But I never went back. 3 months later, I read a small article online. A hiker went missing in Flathead. His name was Daniel Morrow, 32 years old. Last seen heading off trail. They never found him. I didn't recognize the name, but something told me he'd seen what I saw. Maybe more. It's been 6 years now. I live in a small town south of Bend, Oregon. I keep to myself. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and think I hear voices again. Sometimes I check the woods behind my house and see marks in the dirt that shouldn't be there. I don't own land anymore. I don't camp. I don't hike. And I never go near cabins I didn't build myself. In the summer of 2014, I was 32 years old and living in Idaho Falls, working part-time for a contractor and picking up odd jobs on the side. Things weren't going great financially, and I was going through a rough patch after a breakup. So when an old high school friend, Brian, called me out of the blue asking for a favor, I was quick to say yes. Brian had bought a piece of land out in Montana, near a town called Thompson Falls. It was around 2 hours from the nearest Walmart and over 30 minutes from any real paved road. He was building a small cabin there, and while most of the work was done, he needed someone to house sit it for about 2 weeks while he flew out to visit family in Oregon. There'd been some vandalism in the area. Nothing too major, just teenagers breaking windows or knocking over equipment. Still, he wanted someone to stay on the land, just in case. He offered me $500, food in the fridge, and gas money. I didn't ask many questions. I could use the break, I could use the money, and I figured a little time out in nature might do me some good. I packed my gear, sleeping bag, clothes, boots, some books, and a little camping stove just in case. I had no idea what kind of setup he had out there. I drove out the next morning, taking my old Tacoma through winding roads and long stretches of gravel that kicked up so much dust I had to roll the windows up even though it was hot out. By the time I got to the turnoff where his directions said to veer left into the forest, it was already late afternoon. The road turned into dirt, and then it barely looked like a road at all. Just tire tracks cutting through tall grass and overgrown brush. The cabin sat near the bottom of a slope, tucked between pine trees and maybe half a mile from a creek. It was plain and boxy, unfinished plywood on the outside, a tin roof, and a porch that wrapped around the front. There was no cell service at all, which I expected. The power came from a solar battery hooked to the side, and the water was from a tank that collected rain and fed into a basic filter inside. Inside, it was mostly empty. One room with a cot, a mini fridge, a little table with 2 chairs, and some open shelves holding canned food, tools, and a propane heater. The bathroom was an outhouse about 20 feet out back, surrounded by nothing but trees and brush. Before he left, Brian showed me how to turn on the battery, how to check the water, how to lock the storage shed, and where to find the spare key. He left that evening in his truck, heading west, and just like that, I was alone. I didn't mind it at first. The quiet was good. No cars, no people, no distractions. Just the wind in the trees, birds, and the sound of the creek running somewhere down the hill. I spent the first day cleaning up around the cabin, chopping some wood, reading on the porch. At night, I lit a lantern, wrote in a notebook, and fell asleep to the sound of insects outside the window. On the second day, I decided to walk around and explore a bit. The property was huge, around 40 acres, according to Brian. I followed a deer trail up through the trees and found an old fire pit and what looked like the remains of a hunting blind. Later, I found a path down to the creek. The water was cold and fast, and the rocks were slippery, but it felt good to just sit on a boulder and watch the current. That night, I heard something out in the woods. It wasn't the usual animal sounds, no owls or coyotes. This was closer, slow footsteps cracking twigs. I turned off the lantern and looked out the window. I couldn't see anything. I figured maybe it was a deer or an elk. They're big, and when they walk through brush, it sounds like a person. Still, it put me on edge. I stayed up for another hour just listening. Eventually, I heard nothing and went to sleep. The third day was hot. I spent most of it on the porch in the shade, and around mid-afternoon, I decided to hike back up the trail toward the old fire pit. But when I got there, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Boot prints. Not mine. These were wider, longer, and fresher. The dry dirt made the shape clear. Whoever it was had come from the east, where the forest got thicker and steeper. It made my stomach feel tight. I didn't know if someone was hunting, camping nearby, or just passing through. Maybe it was nothing, but I followed the prints a little further east until they disappeared into the undergrowth. That night, I kept a hatchet by the cot. I didn't light the lantern. I just lay there in the dark, listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the sound again. Footsteps on dry leaves. They came close, maybe 30 feet from the cabin, and then stopped. I waited. My ears were ringing from how quiet everything was. No sound came after that. In the morning, I stepped outside and looked around.
No prints.
No sign of anything. but I still felt watched. On the 5th day, I went to check the shed where Brian kept his tools and extra supplies. The lock was still on, but the door looked like it had been jostled. The latch was bent slightly. I opened it, checked everything: generator, fuel, buckets, saws, all still there. But on the ground, I saw something that made me stop. There was a torn-up piece of plastic sheeting and an old army-style canteen. Neither were Brian's. The plastic was muddy and had been folded like a tarp. The canteen was empty, dented, and had a faded name scratched into the side: L. Myers. I didn't know who that was. Later that afternoon, I heard movement up near the trail again. I hiked up carefully, walking slow and quiet. I crouched behind a tree and waited. About 10 minutes passed before I saw someone. A man. He was maybe 50 yards away, half hidden in the trees. Tall, wearing a brown coat, jeans, and a hat. He wasn't carrying a pack or rifle, just standing still, almost like he was listening. He turned slowly, looked in my direction, but I don't think he saw me. After a while, he walked back the way he came, deeper into the forest. I didn't move until he was long gone. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the hatchet close, sat up near the window, and watched the tree line. Around 3 in the morning, I saw a flicker of light, like a lighter or match, way out in the woods, just for a second. The next day, I packed my bag. I didn't tell Brian I was leaving. I couldn't call him anyway, no signal. But I couldn't stay. I had 4 more days to go. But I wasn't willing to wait and find out who that man was or what he wanted. I drove out that afternoon, taking the same overgrown trail back to the gravel road. I kept checking the rearview mirror. Nothing followed me. I didn't see any other cars. Back home, I tried to look up missing persons or escaped convicts in that part of Montana. I found nothing useful, just old news articles about off-grid communities and wilderness survivalists. A week later, Brian called me. He said thanks for watching the place and asked why I left early. I told him the truth about the man, the prints, the movement in the woods. He didn't sound surprised, just quiet. Then he told me something that stuck with me. I probably should have mentioned it, he said. A couple years ago, someone was squatting in the hills east of the property. I thought they moved on. Maybe they didn't. I didn't know what to say. He told me he'd check it out, maybe report it if he saw anything. But I never heard from him again after that call. I didn't try to follow up. That was the last time I agreed to stay in someone else's cabin. Even now, when I walk in the woods, I pay attention to the tree line. I listen for footsteps that aren't mine. I look for flickers of light that don't belong. Because sometimes, it's not the ghosts or monsters you have to worry about. It's the people who live out there and don't want to be found. I retired in late 2018 after almost 26 years of service as an intelligence officer with HM government. My work took me across Europe, North Africa, and once deep into the Balkans during the early 2000s. By the time I turned 53, I had seen enough of what the world looked like behind closed doors. I didn't feel important anymore, just tired. I left London behind and bought a small piece of land in Alberta, near a place called Finch Ridge. Population maybe 200, mostly older folks and farmers. It was the sort of place where people minded their business and expected you to mind yours. I built the cabin myself, not from scratch exactly. I used a prefab shell that came in 3 trucks and spent most of the winter fitting insulation, laying a proper floor, and patching leaks. I didn't do it to live off the grid or start some romantic idea of disappearing. I just wanted silence. I still had a pension, still paid taxes. I just didn't want to be known. The land sloped downward behind the cabin, thick with pine and spruce. Beyond that was the start of a long, narrow valley that I hadn't explored much. From satellite maps, it looked mostly like more forest. The locals said the land down there was hard to walk, lots of gullies and old animal trails that led nowhere. But I kept to myself, never had a reason to go further. That changed one morning in September of 2020. I was out early. I'd heard something odd the night before, heavy, deliberate steps around the back of the cabin. I assumed it was a moose or maybe a black bear. I had motion-triggered floodlights and a weatherproof trail cam on the south corner of the roof. But the light hadn't gone on, and when I checked the footage, the camera was offline, no power. I kept it running on a small battery pack with a solar panel. It had never gone out before, so I went looking. It was just past 7 a.m., low clouds hanging like smoke between the trees. I had my boots on, thick canvas trousers, and an old service jacket I'd modified with extra pockets. I had my sidearm on my belt. Not paranoia, just habit. I still had the license. In my world, you never entirely stop being what you were. I moved behind the cabin and saw the panel had been tilted upward, like something large had bumped it or brushed past it deliberately. The screw holding the tilt bracket was torn out and lying in the grass. No prints, just compressed weeds. That's what pulled me toward the tree line. The woods were quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the dead quiet. No bird calls, no distant rustling. Just my boots pressing into the mossy dirt and the sound of my own breathing. I followed a thin animal trail down the slope, passing over several fallen trees and low brush. I moved slowly, listening. I found something maybe half a mile in. At first, I thought it was an old hunting stand, just a broken wooden platform nailed between two trees. But when I got closer, I saw it wasn't that. It was a kind of observation post, hand-cut planks forming a blind, partially camouflaged with faded burlap and brush netting. There were thick, rusted nails sticking out, and something about it didn't feel right. It wasn't built by a hunter. It was built to watch something. Inside the post, on the rotted wood, I found the remains of a steel thermos, crumbled, dented, half buried in pine needles. No other gear, just a scratched spot on the wooden shelf where someone had rested binoculars or maybe a rifle over and over again. It hadn't been used in years, maybe more, but the path leading to it was still worn. That's what didn't make sense. I decided to follow the path down further into the valley. It wasn't much of a trail. Mostly disturbed brush, broken ferns, and one or two small rock piles that looked like markers. I moved slowly, always scanning. I noticed things as I descended. A wire snare hung from a branch, very old, but placed deliberately. A thin stretch of barbed wire, maybe 20 feet off the trail, strung between two saplings, nearly invisible in the low light. I marked everything with colored ribbon from my pack. I didn't know why. Maybe just force of habit, cataloging, logging, tracking. I didn't expect to find anything important. I just felt that something here wasn't sitting right. The further I went, the less natural the forest felt. Trees grew more tightly together, as if planted. I saw blackened trunks that had been cut low and burnt at the base. That was no wildfire, someone did that by hand. Maybe 10 of them in a row. And then I found the pit. It was nearly 6 feet across and about 4 feet deep, lined with smooth, flat stones. I crouched beside it and saw what looked like old soot caked along the bottom. I thought maybe it was some old fire pit, but there was something wrong about it. Too large, too neat, and too isolated to just be for cooking. And then I saw the wire. Thin copper wire wrapped around a stone on the edge of the pit and then running off into the underbrush. I followed it, hands low, careful not to trip, and found a small dugout about 20 yards away. Someone had buried a sealed plastic drum there. The top was slightly exposed from rain. I dug around the edge with a stick and got my fingers under the lid. Inside were notebooks, 6 of them, all water damaged, but intact. I took out the top one and flipped through the pages. They weren't in English, at least not entirely. Some of it was mixed with strange symbols and numbers. Lots of dates. Observations, maybe. One entry said, activity increased again. For silhouettes, same formation. 3:47 a.m. That made me pause. Not because I understood it, but because the handwriting was sharp and professional. Not the scribbles of a paranoid or someone living in the woods for fun. It was disciplined, like the field notes we used to keep during operations. I took 2 notebooks and put them in my pack. I buried the rest again and marked the spot with a pattern of sticks I'd remember. The hike back up took longer. I kept feeling like I was being watched. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything, but something was behind me, out of reach but close enough to sense. When I reached the cabin again, I stood by the front door for a long time, listening. The sun had come up by then, burning off the clouds. Birds were chirping again, normal sounds, but I still felt off balance. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch with the porch light off, just watching the treeline. Nothing moved, nothing approached, but around 2:30 a.m., I heard 3 sharp, echoing clicks. Not animal noises. They sounded like metal on metal, distant and deliberate. I went inside and locked the doors. Over the next few days, I tried to forget it. I read the notebooks cover to cover. The notes described sightings, people moving through the woods in formation, sometimes crouching. Always between 2:30 and 4 a.m. The writer never described their faces, only their movements and the fact that they carried no lights. They avoided paths. They never vocalized, always in groups of 3 or 4. The last entry in the final book said, they passed behind the cabin at 3:42. One looked up at the camera. That line hit me like a shot to the chest. I went outside the next morning and looked at my camera panel again. It had a small ridge of scratches right on the bottom lip, like someone had touched it gently with something sharp. Not enough to break it, just enough to let me know they'd been there. I packed a bag that afternoon, not out of fear, out of instinct. Before leaving, I copied the most important notebook entries and mailed them to an old colleague in Ottawa who now worked in border intelligence. I didn't explain, just sent it marked, for your eyes only. Then I left for Calgary and rented a flat under a new name. I still own the land, still pay the taxes, but I haven't gone back. Whatever was down in that valley, it wasn't my business anymore. And if someone else is still watching it, I hope they know better than I did. Because in the end, it wasn't about ghosts or creatures or ancient myths. It was just people. People doing something they didn't want others to see. And if they were still using that trail, it meant someone was still watching from the trees. I was just the wrong person who got too curious, too used to seeing things that others ignore. But now I know better, and I don't look back. It was the fall of 2019 when I decided to take a long trip up into the mountains. I was 34 at the time, living in Carson City, Nevada. I worked construction, had done so since my early 20s, but I'd taken some time off after finishing a long contract. I needed space. I needed quiet. I had lost my brother earlier that year in a car crash, and even though people kept saying to talk to someone, I didn't want to talk. I just wanted to get away. My dog, Hank, was an 8-year-old black lab. Strong, loyal, quiet. He'd been with me through almost everything. Breakups, bad days on the job, long nights of drinking. He didn't care what I was going through as long as we were together. I'd heard from a guy I used to work with about an old hunting cabin somewhere up in the Toyabe range. It was out past a dirt road called Cold Wash Trail, off the main highway about 45 miles from town. The guy said it hadn't been used in years, but it still stood solid and dry, tucked away in the trees. I asked for directions, got some GPS coordinates scribbled on paper, and packed up my old 2006 Tacoma with supplies. I didn't tell anyone I was going. No phone signal out there anyway. I packed a rifle, a revolver, a cooler full of food, a water tank, tools, firewood, and plenty of canned stuff. I also brought a bunch of dog food for Hank. The plan was to stay a week. No plans, just relax, hike, maybe fish if I found a stream. It took me 3 hours to reach the trailhead and another 2 hours creeping along the rocky trail to get close to the spot. I parked where the road narrowed out into brush and walked the last half mile with my gear on foot. I found the cabin in the late afternoon. It sat in a clearing, surrounded by a mix of aspen and pine, maybe 100 feet across. The trees were turning yellow and red. The cabin was old gray wood, patched roof, small porch. One window was boarded up, the other had cracked glass. The door was swollen from rain and didn't open easy, but the inside was dry. There was a table, a stove that used propane, which I brought, and a small cot with a bare mattress. Mice had chewed through some of the cabinets, but it didn't smell like anything had been in there recently. I swept it out and set up my things. Hank lay on the wooden floor watching me, tail thumping every time I passed by. That first night was quiet. No wind, just the sound of trees creaking and the occasional branch cracking in the distance. I made some chili, fed Hank, and sat on the small porch in the dark. Stars looked sharper out there. I felt like I'd made the right decision. The second day, I took Hank for a walk up one of the slopes behind the cabin. There was no trail, just patches of dry grass, rock, and brush. I carried the rifle slung over my shoulder just in case. Cougars and bears weren't common, but you never know. About halfway up the ridge, Hank stopped and stared up toward a line of trees. He didn't bark, but his body got rigid and alert. I scanned with the rifle ready, but didn't see anything. Probably just a deer or elk. Still, we circled back the long way. That night, I heard something move outside. I was in the cot half asleep when I heard what sounded like slow, steady footsteps on the dead leaves behind the cabin. Hank stood up instantly. He didn't growl or bark. He just looked toward the wall, ears perked, body tense. I grabbed the revolver from the crate beside the bed and held still. The steps were faint, deliberate, not like an animal. Just slow movement through dry underbrush. Then they stopped. I waited for 20 minutes, gun in hand, heart pounding. Nothing else happened. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I walked a wide loop around the cabin looking for tracks. I found what looked like partial boot prints near the edge of the clearing, but the ground was hard and dry. Could have been anything. Still, something about the shape didn't sit right. It was too narrow at the heel, not like any hiking boot I'd worn. I told myself maybe another hunter had wandered close, though I hadn't seen another truck or person in miles. I started to carry the rifle with me even just to the creek nearby. On the fourth day, I hiked again with Hank, this time east, following a dry creek bed that curved around a low hill. We hiked until we reached a clearing with an old fallen tree in the center. That's when I saw something that made me freeze. On the far side of the clearing, maybe 50 yards away, was a small fire pit. Fresh. Stones were stacked in a circle, blackened with soot. Ashes were cold but recent. There were bones in the pit. Not human, maybe rabbit or something bigger, cracked open, maybe cooked. There were boot prints around the fire, narrow-heeled again. I stood still for a long time, then turned and walked back the way we came, rifle ready. Hank stayed right at my side, ears flat, nose twitching. That night, I locked the cabin door with a chain and propped a chair against it. I set up a string of small empty cans around the back of the cabin using fishing line. It was the only thing I had. Nothing happened that night, but I barely slept. Every sound outside made me grip the revolver tighter. Hank didn't sleep either. He lay awake, eyes open, facing the door. On the fifth day, I thought about packing up and leaving, but I'd come out here to face myself. I didn't want to leave because of nerves. I stayed, but I didn't hike far that day. Around noon, I was chopping wood near the back of the cabin when I heard movement up the hill. Not animals. It was the sound of someone walking. Clearly 2 feet, heavy, cracking branches. I grabbed the rifle and stood still, heart hammering. Then I saw movement behind the trees. A dark shape low to the ground, then upright. A man tall, wearing dark clothing. I only caught a glimpse before he disappeared behind a pine. I shouted out loud, hoping whoever it was would know I was armed. No response, just silence. Hank barked once, sharp and loud, and looked at me. I waited 10 minutes, eyes on the tree line. No one came out. I slowly backed into the cabin and stayed inside the rest of the day. That night, something stepped on the cans behind the cabin. They clattered loud and hard, then silence. Hank went wild, barking and scratching at the back door. I grabbed the rifle and kicked it open. Nothing there. The cans were scattered. Someone had been right up to the wall. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat on the floor with the rifle across my knees and the revolver beside me. Around 3 a.m., I heard movement again. This time on the side of the cabin, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, trying to tell if it was animal or human. Then I saw it, just barely through the cracked front window. A figure, tall, unmoving, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching. I didn't shine a light. I didn't make a sound. I just sat there frozen, Hank growling low beside me. The figure stayed for a long time, maybe 10 minutes. Then it turned and disappeared into the trees. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. The first light, I packed everything fast. I didn't eat, didn't even drink coffee. Just loaded up the essentials. I kept the rifle on my shoulder the whole time. Hank never left my side. When I stepped out into the clearing for the last time, I found something that made my skin crawl. There was a pile of rocks stacked neatly in the middle of the clearing like a marker. On top was a dead rabbit. No head. It hadn't been there the night before. I didn't stop walking. I didn't look back. I marched down the trail with Hank, straight to the truck, and drove nonstop until I hit pavement again. I made it back to Carson City by late afternoon. I parked at home, locked the door, and sat in the living room in silence. That was 6 years ago. I never went back to that place, and I never found out who was out there with me. I checked satellite maps once, just out of curiosity. That clearing wasn't even marked. No roads led there anymore. Hank's gone now. He passed a year ago, but he saved me in a way. Without him, I might have gone outside that night and never come back. I think whoever was out there lived in those woods. Maybe still does. Maybe it was just some hermit or old survivalist. But the way he moved, the way he watched, I knew it wasn't someone who wanted to talk. People say nature heals. Sometimes, though, it just shows you what's been hiding in the quiet. And not everything that walks on 2 legs is someone you want to meet. I was 48 when Hannah died. We'd been separated for almost 5 years by then, but that didn't make it any easier. She passed from ovarian cancer, fast and quiet, and the only reason I found out was because her sister, Dana, called me. The funeral was small. I went because I didn't know how not to. After everything we'd been through, the fighting, the drinking, the long silences, I still felt something when I saw her lowered into the ground. It was final, and I wasn't ready for that. That's the thing about divorce. You get used to thinking they're still out there somewhere, breathing the same air. Then they're not. It wasn't until a few months after the funeral that Dana contacted me again. She told me about the cabin. I had forgotten it even existed. It was a small place tucked up in the Adirondacks in upstate New York. We had bought it together back in 2004, before the marriage went sour. It was meant to be our retreat, a place to get away from phones and people and noise. I had only been there twice. Hannah had used it more than me, especially after we split. I think she found peace there, or maybe just distance. Anyway, Dana said the cabin was still in both our names. Legally, it was mine now. She didn't want anything to do with it, and I didn't blame her. But I didn't want to sell it either, not without seeing it again. Maybe I needed closure, or maybe I just wanted to disappear for a while. I wasn't working much anymore. My job at the auto repair shop had gone part-time, and I wasn't exactly flooded with purpose. So, in early October of 2023, I packed up my truck. Just a few essentials, nothing fancy. And I made the drive from Scroon Lake up into the hills. The road to the cabin was as rough as I remembered. Dirt mostly, narrowed over the years by brush and weather. Nobody maintained it anymore. You had to go real slow past the last mile unless you wanted to lose your oil pan. The trees were already starting to change, red and gold streaks running through the branches. I liked the quiet, the kind of silence that seems to press on your ears. The cabin stood the way I remembered it, weathered and leaning a bit to one side but still standing. The front porch had some rot along the edges, and the screen door was ripped in 3 places. But the lock still worked. I stepped inside and stood for a long while in the doorway, letting the dust and old air settle around me. Smelled like dry wood, mold, and something else. Something stale. There were no signs of rodents or animals inside, which surprised me. Usually places like that get taken over quick. I spent the rest of that first day cleaning. I swept out old leaves, dusted surfaces, and opened windows where I could. The cabin was small, 1 bedroom, a narrow bathroom, a little living area with a wood stove, and a kitchen that hadn't been updated since probably the early 90s. There was no running water anymore, and the solar panel we'd once installed on the roof was completely dead. But I had brought jugs of water and a battery-powered lantern, so I made do. That night, I built a fire in the wood stove and sat on the floor with a can of beans. I listened to the sounds outside. The wind through the trees, branches shifting, the occasional crack in the woods that was probably just a deer. It wasn't frightening. It was peaceful, but that peace didn't last. The first thing I noticed was the cellar door. It was a trapdoor in the kitchen floor, heavy and reinforced with iron hinges. I didn't remember it being there. I wasn't even sure we had a basement back then. But there it was, clearly worn from use, the handle shiny from being grabbed. It unsettled me. I left it alone that night. I told myself I'd check it the next day, maybe when there was more light. But the next day, I woke up feeling strange. I'd slept in the bedroom, which was small and smelled like dust. The bed was the same old wooden frame we had brought up years ago, covered in a thin, musty mattress. I had laid my sleeping bag over it, thinking that would help. But I kept waking up, again and again, to small sounds. Nothing clear, just creaks, groans, like the house settling. At one point, around 3 in the morning, I thought I heard something thump under the floor, just once. Like someone had dropped a box down there. I told myself it was an animal. Maybe a raccoon had gotten in through a vent and was messing around underneath. That made sense, right? After breakfast, just an energy bar and some instant coffee, I went back to the trapdoor. It didn't have a lock. I pulled it open slowly. It groaned loudly, hinges stiff with rust. A narrow wooden stairway led down into blackness. I grabbed my lantern and shined it down. The basement was shallow, maybe 7 feet deep. Dirt floor, stone foundation. I took the steps slowly. They creaked under my weight. Down there, the air was cold and smelled of earth and mildew. The walls were lined with old shelving units, the kind made from cheap plywood and 2x4s. Some of them held jars, tools, and what looked like empty boxes. There were spider webs in the corners. It didn't look like anything had been touched in years, except one thing. In the far corner was a mattress on the floor. Not a new one, yellowed, stained, the kind you'd see left on a sidewalk. Beside it was a small pile of junk, a tin cup, a crusted over plate, a spoon, an empty water bottle. It looked like someone had been living down there, but there was no one now. I stood frozen for what felt like 5 minutes. I listened hard, trying to hear if someone was still nearby, but it was dead silent. That night, I didn't sleep well. I didn't lock the trapdoor. I didn't want to make noise, but I stacked a chair and 2 toolboxes on top of it, just in case. Around 2 a.m., I woke up sweating. I thought I'd heard something move in the kitchen, like a soft scraping sound. But when I got up and opened the bedroom door, there was nothing. The chair and boxes were still stacked right where I left them. I started leaving the cabin during the day. I'd take walks, sometimes up the ridge trail behind the cabin. Other times I'd just wander through the trees. The cold air helped clear my head. I even found some of the old hiking markers we had nailed to trees 20 years ago. But each time I came back, I felt like the cabin had shifted. Not physically, just the feeling inside, like it had been disturbed, like someone had moved while I was gone and then quickly set things back. On the 4th day, I found footprints. They were on the wooden floor of the kitchen, bare feet, small. They had come from the trapdoor and ended near the wood stove. There were smudges in the ash around the base, like someone had crouched there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair with a hunting knife in my lap, listening, but nothing happened. On the 5th day, I hiked down into town. Took me 2 hours. I didn't tell anyone anything, just picked up more supplies, food, batteries, some nails, a lock. I wanted to put something on that trapdoor that would make noise if it moved. That night, I locked the trapdoor shut from the top using a bracket and padlock I installed. Then I nailed a string of old keys along the top edge so they'd rattle if the door lifted even slightly. I also jammed an empty tin can underneath the doorknob of the front door so it would fall if anyone came in. The next morning, the can was still there. The keys hadn't moved, but the padlock was gone. Just gone.
No scratch marks. No bent bracket.
Just an empty hole where the lock had been. I should have left right then, but I didn't. Something about it made me want to understand. I felt like the cabin was keeping something from me. Or maybe I was just too stubborn to admit I was scared. That evening, I went down into the basement again. The mattress was gone. In its place was a piece of plywood, covering part of the dirt floor. I pried it up. Underneath, there was a hole about 3 feet wide, maybe 4 feet deep. It looked like someone had been digging it out by hand. The edges were rough, and there were claw marks in the dirt. Not animal claw marks, fingernails. I stood up fast. The hair on my neck was standing. I backed up the stairs slowly and closed the trapdoor behind me. That night, the sounds started again. Scraping, soft at first, then more insistent, like nails dragging across wood. I stayed awake the whole time, holding the knife. I wanted to believe it was just in my head. But then, at 3:17 a.m., the keys rattled. Not hard, just once. A soft clink like someone had barely touched the trapdoor. I didn't move. Eventually, the noise stopped. I left the next morning. I didn't pack much, just grabbed the essentials, threw them in the truck, and took off down the road. I didn't even lock the cabin behind me. I didn't want to. Back in Scroon Lake, I thought about burning the place down, or calling the cops. But what would I tell them? That my ex-wife's old cabin had a spooky basement and some footprints? I ended up putting the cabin up for sale. It's still listed. Nobody's touched it. I doubt anyone will. Sometimes I think about going back, but I don't think I ever will. A few weeks ago, I got a brown envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed the trapdoor, wide open. A hand was on the steps, just reaching up. It wasn't Hannah's hand, but it was definitely a woman's, and her fingernails were cracked and full of dirt. It was October of 2019. I had just turned 31 a few weeks earlier, and I wanted to get away for a weekend. Not because of anything big, really, I just needed to step away from everything for a bit. I lived in a small apartment in Kansas City, Missouri, where the traffic and noise just didn't seem to stop, even at night. I worked maintenance at a warehouse just outside town, long hours, rotating shifts, and no real routine to speak of. My back was always sore, my sleep was always off, and my phone never stopped buzzing. I didn't want to go far. I just wanted peace, real peace, somewhere I could hear wind in the trees and nothing else. I remembered a place a friend once mentioned, near a small lake not far from Warsaw, Missouri. He said there were old hunting cabins out there, basic, quiet, and cheap. They weren't even advertised much anymore, but if you knew someone, you could get a key. He had passed me the number of a guy named Richard, an older man who handled the rentals. I called Richard and arranged to rent a cabin for 2 nights. It cost me just $80 for the weekend. He warned me it was isolated, had no running water, and that I'd need to bring my own supplies. That was perfect for me. I wasn't looking for comfort. I just wanted stillness. I left early Saturday morning. I packed light, a backpack with canned food, a small cooler of water bottles, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, extra socks, and a small hunting knife I always took when I hiked. I drove out on Highway 7 and then took a narrow county road that twisted into gravel and finally narrowed into a single-lane dirt track. It was about 10 a.m. when I pulled up to the gate Richard had told me about. The cabin sat maybe 200 yards off the road, tucked into a mix of pine and oak trees. The path that led up to it was worn, muddy in places, and overgrown. My old Honda struggled a bit on the incline, tires spinning a few times, but it made it. The structure was small, with grayish wood faded from sun and rain. The front porch was crooked, like one corner had sunk deeper into the earth than the others. There were no other cabins in sight, just woods, stretching thick and wide around me. It was exactly what I needed. I parked off to the side and walked up to the door. The key Richard had mailed me worked fine. Inside, the cabin was bare. One main room with a cot in the corner, a small metal stove, and a wooden table with 2 mismatched chairs. Dust covered most surfaces, and spiderwebs hung in the corners. It smelled like dry wood and something older, maybe old animal fur or just time. I opened the windows to air it out and dropped my bag onto the cot. I spent the next hour walking the area, just getting a sense of the place. There were no other buildings nearby, no tire tracks except my own. The nearest house or town was probably 10 or 12 miles away. I sat on the porch with a can of beans for lunch and felt more relaxed than I had in weeks. The woods were quiet. The sun poked through the leaves. I could hear birds, and now and then a squirrel would dart across the underbrush. The breeze was cool, and it carried that earthy smell that you only get in fall. The first strange thing happened that evening, just before sunset. I had started gathering some dry branches and wood to build a small fire in the metal fire ring out back. I had a box of matches and brought some old newspaper from home to get it going. As I bent down to pile the kindling, I noticed something in the trees maybe 30 yards back, just a flash of movement. I froze and stared. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or coyote, but then I saw what looked like part of a jacket, dark green or maybe brown. It disappeared behind a tree. I stood up and waited, but nothing moved again. The forest was still. I told myself someone was probably just hiking or hunting. The land was technically public in some spots, though Richard had said this cabin sat on private grounds. I kept looking over that way for a while, but nothing else moved. Eventually, I lit the fire and sat outside as the sun dipped down behind the trees. It was pitch black by 7:30. I stayed out for maybe an hour, eating another can of food and watching the flames. No more movement. The air got cold, fast. I put out the fire and went inside, locking the door behind me. The cabin didn't have electricity, so I used my flashlight and placed it on the table, shining upwards so it spread light around the room. I laid out my sleeping bag on the cot and climbed in, still wearing my jeans and flannel. I kept the knife close just in case. I wasn't scared, just cautious. It was hard to fall asleep, though. Not because of noise, but because it was so completely quiet. No city hum, no cars. Just the sound of wind moving through the trees outside. Somewhere around 1 a.m., I heard it. First, it was faint. A single, crisp footstep on dried leaves. Then another. I opened my eyes, heart thudding in my chest. I stayed perfectly still. There it was again, closer, like someone walking slowly around the cabin. Leaves crunching, twigs snapping. Then nothing. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. I didn't move to the window. I didn't want to be seen. I just waited, holding my breath. Minutes passed. No more footsteps. Just silence again. Eventually, I turned off the light and laid back down. But I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. I checked for footprints. The ground was dry and packed tight, so it was hard to see anything clear, but I swear I saw a few scuffed marks by the side of the cabin, like someone had walked along the wall, then stepped back into the woods. Could have been an animal. Could have been me from the day before. I wasn't sure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, watching. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to back down over nothing. Could have been a hunter or some kid screwing around. I stayed. That day, I hiked further down the ridge behind the cabin. I found a small creek and followed it for a while. It was peaceful and I tried to enjoy it, but I kept checking over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone all day. No hikers, no hunters, nothing. Just trees. When I got back around 4 p.m., I found something on the porch. It was a nail, long, rusty, and stuck point up in a crack between the floorboards right where someone would step coming out the front door. I hadn't put it there. I crouched and looked closer. The nail had been pushed down into the crack hard, almost perfectly upright. I felt sick. That wasn't an accident. Someone had done that on purpose. I pulled the nail out and looked around. Again, nothing. The woods were calm, quiet, no sign of anyone. This time I built the fire bigger and sat with my back to the cabin wall. I kept my knife on my lap. I didn't eat. I just watched the trees, waiting. I didn't hear anything that night.
No footsteps.
No movement. But I didn't sleep. Not even a little. By the time dawn came, I had already packed up my bag. I planned to leave the moment the light was strong enough to drive safely. But as I walked around to the back of the cabin to grab the trash bag I'd left tied to a hook, I stopped cold. There were scratches on the back wall. Deep, wide ones. Not animal scratches. These were wide grooves, like someone had dragged a large nail or metal object across the wood over and over again. One of the scratches cut right into the window frame. That window had been above where I was sleeping. I didn't even take the trash. I threw my stuff into the car and reversed down the path without even turning around. The drive out felt like a fever dream. My heart was pounding the whole way. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. I drove straight back to Kansas City, got home, and locked every door behind me. I never called Richard, never told him what happened. But about 3 weeks later, I was scrolling the local news one night and saw a headline. Asterisk body found near Lake Truman cabin. Asterisk, there wasn't much detail, but the article said a man in his 40s had been found off a trail near one of the old rental cabins. No foul play was ruled out yet, but they suspected exposure. They said he was dressed for camping but had no ID. His camp was never found. They showed a small picture of the area, the same crooked porch I had sat on. I don't know who that man was or what happened to him. I don't know if it was connected to what I experienced. But I know what I saw. I know someone was out there, and it wasn't some drunk hunter or kid messing around. I still think about it some nights. The footsteps, the nail, the scratches, and how completely quiet the woods can be. I haven't gone camping since. It was October 2019 when I decided to take a break from everything for a while. I was 32 years old, burnt out from my job, and my phone was buzzing nonstop even after office hours. I worked in a logistics company in Bristol, and the stress had been building up for months. One morning, I looked at myself in the mirror, and I didn't even recognize my own face. That's when I knew I had to get away. I went online, scrolling through listings of remote places to rent in the countryside. I didn't want a hotel or a cottage with tourists nearby. I wanted complete isolation. That's when I came across a listing for a small cabin near a village called Dalgellow in North Wales. It was in the middle of a patch of forest, a 10-minute drive off the main road, no neighbors for a mile in any direction, no internet, no mobile signal. It sounded perfect. The cabin was owned by an older couple who lived about half an hour away. They told me I'd be completely alone there, but it had electricity, running water, and a small gas heater. I booked it for 10 days and set out on a cold Thursday morning. The drive from Bristol to Dalgellow took longer than I expected. Roads narrowed the closer I got to the place, turning into winding single-track lanes. By the time I reached the cabin, it was already early evening and the sun was dipping behind the hills. The cabin was smaller than it looked in the pictures. A single-floor, wooden structure with a sloped roof and a small front porch. It had a wood-burning stove, a couch, a little kitchenette with a kettle and microwave, a bed in the corner, and a small bathroom tucked behind a sliding door. The air smelled like pine and old timber. The forest wrapped around the back and sides of the cabin, so tightly that from inside, all you could see out the windows was a wall of trees. That first night, I just sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket, drinking tea and listening to the silence. I hadn't heard silence like that in years. No sirens, no buzzing lights, not even birds. Just the occasional creak of the cabin wood shifting with the temperature. I slept early and deep, probably the best sleep I'd had in months. The next couple of days were peaceful. I took walks along the narrow gravel path that led back to the road. I explored the edges of the forest, careful not to get too deep in. I spent hours just sitting on the porch with a book. I didn't bring my laptop, didn't check my phone once. For a while, I forgot about everything. But on the fourth day, something strange happened. That afternoon, I decided to walk a little further than usual. The weather had turned cold and overcast, but it wasn't raining. I followed the gravel path for about a mile, past the point I normally turn back. I noticed something in the trees, a few dozen yards off the path. It looked like an old bench, half rotten, covered in moss. I stepped off the trail to look at it. When I got closer, I saw something else. A small clearing, almost perfectly circular, maybe 20 feet across. In the middle was a stone fire pit with a metal grate, half buried in leaves. It looked like no one had used it in years. I stood there a while, trying to figure out why it felt so off. The trees around the clearing were all bent inward slightly, almost like they were leaning toward the center. The ground was covered in a thick layer of dead leaves, but I could see faint shapes in them, disturbances like someone had walked through recently. I shook it off, probably deer or hikers. Still, something made me head back to the cabin quicker than usual. That night, I couldn't sleep as well. The wind picked up and tapped against the windows. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate crunching on the gravel. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and stared toward the window. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but the footsteps stopped. I told myself it was a deer or my imagination. I eventually drifted off again. The next day, I didn't leave the cabin. I kept the stove going, made tea, and tried to relax, but I kept thinking about that clearing. Around 5 p.m., I went outside to get more firewood from the stack at the back. That's when I saw something that made my stomach twist. There were footprints on the gravel, bare feet, narrow, slightly uneven, like the left foot dragged a little. They were fresh. The The wind hadn't blown them away yet. They led from the edge of the woods near the back and circled the cabin once. Then they disappeared the way they came. I didn't know what to think. Who the hell walks barefoot through a freezing forest? I locked the door and moved the small table in front of it. That night, I left the lights on. I didn't sleep much. By morning, I convinced myself it had to be a prank. Maybe the owners were messing with me. But when I checked my phone, still no signal. I couldn't even call anyone to check. I thought about leaving early, but I'd already paid for the full stay. Besides, I told myself it's just nerves. City brain trying to make something out of nothing. That afternoon, I heard something again. Not footsteps this time. Something brushing against the wall of the cabin, near the back. I waited a minute, then quietly walked to the rear window and peeked out. First, I didn't see anything. Then I caught a glimpse of something moving behind the trees. Person. A woman. She was wearing a gray, tattered dress that looked like it had been soaked through. Her hair was long and matted, hanging over her face. She moved slowly, almost limping, like one leg didn't work right. She didn't look up. She just wandered past the cabin, about 30 feet away, and disappeared into the trees. I stood frozen for a long time. My chest was tight. I kept waiting for her to come back, to knock on the door, to say something, to scream. Nothing happened. Night fell and I sat on the couch, staring at the door. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I just waited. The next morning, I packed. I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't care about the money or the break from work. I had to leave. I threw my bag in the car and started the engine. The tires skidded slightly on the gravel as I backed out. As I turned onto the forest path, I looked in the rearview mirror. She was standing on the porch, not moving, just standing there, her dress hanging off her like wet rags, her face still hidden behind her hair. She didn't wave. She didn't chase me. She just watched as I drove away. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. I didn't even breathe until I was 20 miles away. I found a small hotel in the next town and stayed there the night. I called the owners the next day and told them I'd left early. They didn't ask why. They just said, "All right then." I never told anyone what happened. Not my friends, not my boss, not my family. I kept it to myself for years. Until now. I still don't know who she was or what she was doing out there. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she was dangerous. Maybe she'd been living in those woods for years, hiding from something or someone. All I know is she was real as the cold air and the rotting leaves, as real as the way she looked at me without ever raising her head. I still get nightmares sometimes, not of her face, I never saw it, but of the way she stood, still quiet, almost forgotten, like she didn't belong in the world anymore, like the forest had kept her, and she had nowhere else to go. I've never gone camping since, never rented another cabin. I keep the curtains closed at night, even in the city, because sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can still hear bare feet on gravel. And I'm terrified that one day, I'll look out the window and see her again, still standing there, still watching. I had just turned 34 that spring in 2016 when I decided to take some time off from work. I'd been working construction in southern Missouri for about a decade, and between the constant noise, the tight deadlines, and the endless rush of city life, I felt burnt out. I wasn't married, had no kids, and besides my job, I didn't really have a reason to stay around Springfield for a while. So I thought I'd drive north, find somewhere quiet, spend a week or two in the woods, and clear my head. I had an old pickup, a rusted-out blue Ford from the early 2000s that still ran strong. I loaded it up with some canned food, a good amount of water, my camping gear, a hunting knife, a flashlight with spare batteries, and a little .22 rifle I'd had for years. I wasn't going to hunt, but it made me feel safer carrying it. My plan was to head up near Sandhill Pines, a patch of land outside of Macon County. I'd read online that there were some old logging trails and forgotten areas there that nobody really messed with anymore. No campsites, no hikers, no towns for a dozen miles in either direction. Sounded perfect. The first few days went like I hoped. I parked my truck off a dirt trail about 4 or 5 miles in. You could barely even tell there was a road anymore, just weeds and brush where old tires had once passed through. I set up camp just a short walk off the trail, hidden behind a small ridge and a line of pines. It was peaceful, quiet, other than birds and the wind. I spent my time reading, walking around, and sitting by the small fire pit I made with stones. The silence felt like medicine. On the 4th day, I woke up early and started exploring a little farther out than I had before. The woods were thick, but not impossible to navigate. I followed a dry creek bed for over an hour until I spotted something strange. Straight lines in the distance, cutting between the trees. Buildings don't blend well in nature. Your eyes can't help but notice flat surfaces and angles. As I got closer, I saw what looked like an old structure, worn down and half hidden behind thickets and vines. It was a cabin, or had been once. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The roof sagged heavy with years of rot, some of the shingles sliding down onto the dirt. The porch was still mostly intact, though one side had collapsed inward. The front door hung open just enough to see darkness inside. A rusted shovel leaned against the wall, its handle bleached gray by time. Everything about the place said forgotten, abandoned. I walked around the outside first. It was small, probably just 1 or 2 rooms. The back of the cabin was partially sunken, like the foundation had given out from years of water and erosion. I saw no tracks, no signs anyone had been there in years. No trash, no footprints, not even cigarette butts or broken beer bottles. Just dirt, leaves, and silence. I should have turned back. That's what I keep thinking now. But I was curious. I stepped up onto what was left of the porch. The wood moaned under my boots but didn't give out. I pushed the door open with the end of my rifle. It creaked, dry and slow, and the smell hit me first. Old wood, mold, and something stale and earthy. Not rot exactly, more like wet leaves sealed in a box for years. Inside, it was dark even with daylight outside. The windows were either broken or covered in grime. I waited a few seconds for my eyes to adjust. There were 2 rooms just like I thought. The main room had a small table with one leg broken off and an overturned chair. In the corner, a wood stove covered in cobwebs. A shelf lined with dusty jars and what looked like old canned goods, some so rusted I couldn't read the labels. The other room looked like a sleeping area, cot with torn fabric, a small dresser with the drawers pulled out. Papers were scattered on the floor, most of them faded and unreadable. I didn't touch much. I just looked. I wasn't there to steal or mess around, I just wanted to see. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. In the corner of the bedroom was a small hole in the floor. It wasn't part of the original design. The boards around it had been pried up, not broken, but removed clean, like someone had intentionally made an opening. I knelt and shone my flashlight down. It was too dark to see far, but I could tell there was a space below, maybe a root cellar or crawl space. Something about it felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, just off. I stood up and told myself I'd seen enough. I walked back out into the fresh air and left the cabin behind. All the way back to my camp, though, I kept thinking about that hole in the floor. It itched at the back of my mind like a question I didn't want to answer. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up, not because of sounds, but because I couldn't stop thinking about that cabin. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that, but it bothered me, felt too untouched, too silent, like it had been left alone for a reason. The next morning, I couldn't help it. I went back. I packed a few things first. A stronger flashlight, a small crowbar, rope, my water bottle. I didn't plan to stay long, but I wanted to be ready. The walk back took a little over an hour. When I got to the cabin, it looked the same, lifeless and heavy, like it had been waiting. Inside, I made my way back to that hole in the floor. I cleared away the boards around it a little more, just enough to widen the space. I tied the rope to a beam and lowered it down. Then I climbed in. It wasn't deep, maybe 6 feet. The air smelled worse down there, damp and sour. My boots landed on dirt. I raised my flashlight and looked around. It wasn't a storage space. There were no jars or tools or boxes, just dirt walls, a low ceiling made of thick beams, and some kind of blanket or tarp on the floor across from me. I moved closer. The blanket covered something. Pile, maybe. The shape underneath wasn't clear. I bent down, reached slowly, and peeled back the edge. Underneath were bones. Real ones. I froze. My heart started pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. The bones were old, yellowed, but still mostly together. A full skeleton. Human. I dropped the blanket and backed up against the wall. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to climb out and run straight back to the truck. But another part of me couldn't leave it like that. I took a few deep breaths and forced myself to look again. There was something else down there. A rusted metal box. It was half buried beside the skeleton. I pulled it out with shaking hands and opened it. Inside were photos, black and white, some faded beyond recognition, but others still showed faces. Men in hunting clothes, a boy standing next to a deer, a woman on a porch. I kept flipping through them. Toward the bottom were newspaper clippings. Headlines like, "Missing Boy 11, Last Seen Near Pine Road," "Macon Man Vanishes on Weekend Hike," "Third Local Hunter Disappears in AS Many Years." There were at least 7 different articles, some from the 80s, some as recent as 2001. My stomach turned. I realized then that the skeleton in that crawl space wasn't just someone who died of natural causes and got buried under the cabin. Someone put them there. Someone had been using that cabin. I climbed out fast, left the box where I found it. I didn't take anything. I didn't touch anything else. I just ran back through the woods, down the creek bed, back to camp. I didn't sleep that night. I packed up before the sun rose and drove straight to the nearest ranger station I could find. I told them everything. The cabin, the crawl space, the bones, the articles. They didn't say much at first, just took notes, asked for directions, and told me they'd follow up. I never heard what they found. Weeks went by, then months. I called once, but the ranger I talked to said the case had been passed to local authorities and there were no further updates. That was it. I never went back to that area. Sometimes I wonder who buried those people, if it was one person or more, if they were ever caught. But most of all, I wonder how many more are buried out there, in cabins nobody remembers, places that look forgotten, but aren't. I was 29 the year I stayed alone in the old cabin beside the abandoned graveyard in central Kentucky. It was late October 2019. I'd taken a break from work after a rough few months. I was a warehouse manager back in Cincinnati, and I'd been dealing with long hours, a boss who micromanaged everything, and back pain that wouldn't go away. I just needed quiet, a break from phones, emails, coworkers, and fluorescent lights. So when I saw a listing on a small rental site for a cabin perfect for hunters, campers, or off-grid riders, I booked it immediately. The pictures showed an old wooden structure surrounded by trees, and off to the side, a rusted metal fence surrounding a graveyard. The owner claimed it was all private property, 50 acres. No one else would be around. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just space to sit, breathe, and be away from everything. The place was about 20 miles south of Danville, off a narrow 2-lane road, then another 5 miles on gravel. The last stretch was rough, my Honda's tires slipping in the soft ruts. When I finally got there, it was near dark. The trees around the property were mostly bare, their leaves covering the path up to the front porch. The cabin looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The wood was weathered gray, the windows cloudy, the roof sloping slightly on the left. But the lockbox on the door worked, and when I stepped inside, the place smelled only faintly of must. It was small, just a main room with a bed, with stove, table, and a tiny bathroom in the back with a compost toilet. A big, dusty jug of water sat on the counter with a stack of paper towels. I brought a cooler with simple groceries and enough bottled water to last the week. I had books, a solar charger for my phone, and a notebook. I left my work laptop at home. That first night, I ate cold turkey and bread, then sat on the creaky wooden chair and listened to the woods. Nothing but the rustling of dry leaves and the far-off calls of owls. No cars.
No voices. No noise.
The graveyard was maybe 30 yards from the back porch. The fence was old iron, leaning in places, the kind you'd see around small rural cemeteries. Most of the gravestones looked broken or tilted. I counted maybe 15 from the cabin's back steps. It was quiet, still, the kind of still that makes your ears ring. I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, I woke early and made instant coffee with my camp stove. I stepped outside with the mug and looked at the graveyard again. In the daylight, it felt less creepy, just old, forgotten. The stones were from the 1800s mostly. I walked over and stepped through the gate. It hung from one hinge, barely held up. There were no flowers, no signs anyone had visited recently. Some of the graves were just chunks of rock, no writing. Others had names: Sarah Hill, 1821 to 1859. Thomas R. Hill, 1816 to 1853. Most of them had the same last name. Probably the family that had once lived here. No big deal. Just a family plot behind a cabin that had survived the years. Still, I felt weird standing there, so I walked back to the porch and sat in the sunlight. I tried to read but kept glancing back. That night, I cooked some beans on the stove, ate in silence, and turned in early. But something changed. At around 1 a.m., I woke up to the sound of wood creaking. It wasn't the wind. It was slow, heavy, like someone stepping on the porch. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding. There was no electricity out here, no porch light. I had no gun, just a small knife in my pack. I stayed perfectly still and listened. Nothing. Then again, creak. I sat up slowly and reached for my flashlight. I didn't turn it on right away. I waited. The sound didn't come back. After 5 minutes, I stood, moved to the front window, and looked out through the dusty glass. Nothing but black trees and scattered moonlight. I went back to bed but didn't sleep. In the morning, I checked the porch. No footprints, but the leaves had been disturbed. Maybe it was a raccoon, or maybe the wood was shifting from the cold. I tried to forget it. I hiked a bit that afternoon, found a trail that looped behind the cabin and came out near a dried creek bed. The property really was isolated. I didn't see a single house or car or fence. It was peaceful, mostly, but I kept thinking about that graveyard. Every time I walked past the back window, I looked at it. Couldn't help it. That third night, the creaking came back. A single step on the porch, then nothing. Then again about 20 minutes later. Then again. I stayed up most of the night, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing. No animals, no people, no movement. By morning, I was tense. I felt like I was being watched. I reminded myself that no one knew I was here except the property owner. But my nerves were getting frayed. I started checking the windows constantly. I stopped reading. I even moved my sleeping bag to the middle of the floor so I wouldn't be near the windows. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, being alone out here with that graveyard right outside. On the fourth day, I noticed something that didn't make sense. I walked out to the graveyard again in full daylight. I don't know why, I just needed to prove to myself it wasn't creepy, that it was just stone and dirt. But when I looked closer, I noticed one of the headstones I'd seen earlier, Sarah Hill, wasn't in the same spot. It had been near the fence before, tilted to the left. Now it was farther back, almost next to the tree line. At first, I thought I was wrong, but then I noticed the imprint in the dirt where it had been, clear as day. I stood there staring at it for a long time. The stone was heavy, probably over 100 pounds. There's no way an animal could have moved it, and it hadn't fallen. It was upright, just in a new place. I backed out of the graveyard, walked straight into the cabin, and locked the door. That evening, I packed a few things and put them by the door, just in case. I didn't want to admit I was scared, but I kept telling myself it was some bored teenager messing around. But the drive-in was so isolated, it didn't make sense. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around 2 a.m., I heard the creaking again. Then footsteps, this time more than one. Slow, deliberate, moving along the side of the cabin. The leaves crunching outside the window. I sat in the middle of the floor, flashlight aimed at the door. Couldn't breathe right. My mind was racing, thinking about all the things that could happen out here. No one would hear me scream. No one would even know I was gone for days. The sound stopped around 4 a.m. I stayed frozen in place until the sun came up. That morning, I made the decision to leave. I started loading my cooler, my sleeping bag, my clothes. I was almost done when I looked out the back window and saw something that made my blood go cold. There was a shovel standing upright in the middle of the graveyard. It hadn't been there the day before. The ground around it had been disturbed. Not a full hole, just the start of one. The shovel was old and rusted, but it hadn't been there when I arrived. I was sure of it. I grabbed my last few things, ran to the car, and threw everything in the trunk. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I drove straight to Danville, to the nearest gas station, and stayed there for 2 hours. I just sat in the car trying to calm down. Eventually, I called the property owner and told him I'd left early. He didn't ask questions. I didn't offer details. I just said something had come up. Back home in Cincinnati, I couldn't shake it. I kept thinking about that shovel, the footsteps, the gravestone that moved. I knew I hadn't imagined it. I went back online and tried to find the listing again, but it was gone. The page just showed an error. I tried to look up the address, but it wasn't listed anywhere. Not on Google Maps, not on any public records I could find. It's been years since that trip, and I still don't know what happened out there. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I'll never forget that feeling. That cold, deep fear when I realized someone else was out there with me. Someone who had been watching. Someone who had been walking past the windows at night, stepping on the porch, moving headstones, and digging into the ground just behind the cabin. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in monsters. But I do believe that some people are capable of very strange things. And some places are better left alone. I haven't gone camping since. I was 36 when I took a week off work in late October 2021 to spend time in the woods. I needed the break. I'd been burned out, tired of sitting in front of screens, meetings that went nowhere, and just the noise of daily life. I'd saved up a good chunk of time off, and my plan was simple. Take my gear, go up north to a small hunting cabin that used to belong to an old friend of my father's, and spend a few days out there with just the trees, my rifle, and the cold. The cabin sat about 15 miles northeast of Minong, Wisconsin, tucked deep in the Chequamegon Forest region. It wasn't anything fancy, just a single-room structure with a wood stove, a twin bed, an outhouse about 50 feet behind the place, and no power or plumbing. I'd been there once with my dad as a teenager, but it had been over 20 years, and I barely remembered anything except the sharp cold and the silence. That was the appeal now. I packed my truck with the essentials: canned food, a small cooler, 2 gallons of water, extra layers, boots, my scoped Remington 700, a portable power bank, a few batteries, headlamp, and an old topo map. I had no plans to rely on GPS too much. I knew reception would be spotty at best, and I didn't want to end up out there completely blind if my phone died. The first day went smoothly. I arrived around noon, and even though the path to the cabin was overgrown and littered with fallen branches, my 4x4 made it in after some rough crawling. The cabin looked older but intact. There was a rusty lock on the front door, but I had the key. Inside, it smelled like dust and dry wood. There were old cans on the shelves, mouse droppings in the corners, and a thick layer of grime on everything. I aired it out, swept as best I could, and got the wood stove going just before sunset. That night, I fell asleep early in my sleeping bag on top of the bed, the stove crackling beside me. The silence was deep, thicker than I remembered silence being. It was almost like a presence in itself. No traffic, no hum of electricity, just wind and cold air seeping through cracks. I felt oddly calm. I hadn't felt that kind of stillness in years. The next day, I got up early, made a cup of instant coffee, and stepped out into the frosty air. The ground crunched under my boots. I headed northeast where the terrain sloped gently and opened up into a clearing I remembered from when I was younger. It was good hunting ground, old deer trails, signs of foraging, and cover on all sides. I settled in near a downed tree and waited. Hours passed with little movement. A few squirrels darted across the forest floor. Some birds chirped and then went quiet. Around noon, I heard something heavy in the brush. Maybe 70 yards to my left, but it never showed. I held my breath, waiting, but whatever it was moved off, slow and steady. I chalked it up to a cautious buck and made a mental note to return to that spot the next morning. On my way back to the cabin that evening, I noticed something strange. A tree, not a huge one, maybe 6 inches thick, had fallen across the narrow path leading back. It looked fresh. The bark was torn near the base, and the roots still clung to dirt. I stood there staring at it for a second. It hadn't been windy.
No storms.
It didn't look like rot. Something about the way it leaned felt wrong, like it had been pushed or even cut. But I didn't see any marks. I climbed over it and kept walking. That night, I felt uneasy. I double-checked the cabin door and latched the small window, even though no one was around for miles. I kept the fire going low and tried reading from a paperback I brought, but I couldn't focus. Around 1 a.m., I woke up cold. The stove had burned out. I pulled on a jacket and boots and stepped outside to grab more wood from the small stack I'd made earlier. That's when I saw footprints. At first, I thought maybe they were mine, but they weren't. They were wider, flatter, and they came from the woods behind the cabin, where I hadn't gone. They led up toward the outhouse, paused there, then circled toward the side window and stopped by the cabin door. I didn't move. My breath was visible in the freezing air, and everything around me felt locked in place. I scanned the tree line. Nothing. No movement.
No sounds.
I backed up slowly, went back inside, bolted the door with the latch and a metal hook I'd found inside, and sat there with my rifle across my lap until the sun rose. The next morning, I forced myself to act normal. I told myself it was probably a hiker, maybe some drifter or someone lost, even though it didn't make sense. No tire tracks, no camps nearby, and who wanders around at night in 30-degree weather in the middle of nowhere? I went back to the clearing but couldn't stop checking over my shoulder. Every small sound felt bigger. Every twig snap made my stomach tighten. I didn't see anything all day, Not even a squirrel. Back at the cabin, I noticed the footprints were gone. Either the wind had softened them, or the frost had melted them out. I checked the trees nearby. Nothing. No sign of anyone. Still, I dragged a few logs across the front of the door from the inside that night and kept my rifle close. That was the third night, and it was the worst. It started around 3 a.m. I heard something or someone walking outside. Slow, steady steps circling the cabin. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Pause. I didn't move from the bed. I held my breath and just listened. It circled the cabin twice. Then it stopped by the window. There was a long pause. I didn't hear breathing, but I felt something. A weight in the air. Then came a sound I'll never forget. Not a voice. Not an animal. It was something like dragging. A slow, sharp pull of metal or stone against the cabin wall, starting from the window and moving down toward the bottom edge. Not fast, just deliberate. I didn't move for the rest of the night. When the sun came up, I grabbed my gear and walked the perimeter. There were marks, deep scrapes in the wood where something had dragged across it. Not claws, not an axe, something uneven. I looked for tracks again but found none. The ground had frozen hard overnight. That was the moment I decided to leave early. I packed everything into the truck, didn't even bother sweeping up or cleaning the cabin. I got in, turned the engine over, and backed out slow down the trail. The fallen tree from before had been moved. Not cut, not dragged, just moved off the trail about 4 feet to the side. I drove out of there faster than I should have, every shadow in the trees looking like something watching me. I didn't go straight home. I stopped in Minong, got a motel room, and slept with the TV on. The next morning, I looked over my truck. On the driver's side, low near the wheel well, was a deep scrape. Long, uneven, like someone had dragged something sharp against it. I hadn't seen it before. I told a ranger about it when I stopped at a rest area farther south. I didn't tell him everything, just said I thought someone might have been squatting out there or maybe following me. He said that area had a history of off-grid types, people who didn't want to be found. He told me next time I should go with a buddy. I nodded and thanked him, but I wasn't planning a next time. It's been almost 4 years since that trip. I haven't been back to the woods. I still hunt, but never alone, and never more than a few miles from a road. I think about that cabin a lot, about the footsteps, the scrape, the marks on the truck, and the tree. Somewhere out there in that thick forest is someone who watched me from the woods for days, who walked up to that cabin at night and scratched along the window like they were tracing a shape they'd done 100 times before. I don't know what they wanted. I don't care anymore. But I know this much now: when you go deep enough into the woods, you stop being alone long before you realize it. And whatever's out there watching, it doesn't always stay in the trees. It was the fall of 2009, and I was 34 years old at the time. I'd been working as a contractor in Arkansas, mostly building porches, fixing fences, and doing odd jobs for folks around Little Rock. I didn't grow up with much, and I sure as hell didn't expect to ever own land. But when my uncle passed, he left me a tiny piece of wooded property near the edge of the Ozarks, just under 4 acres, nothing fancy. It had been in the family since the 50s, but no one had done anything with it in years. I figured I could build a little getaway cabin there, just for myself. No plumbing, no internet, no phone lines. Just a basic dry cabin I could escape to when things got too noisy in town. I had been planning this for about 8 months. Took measurements, cleared a section of the land out by hand with a chainsaw and a rented stump grinder, and brought in some pressure-treated wood and a couple of sheets of galvanized steel for the roof. The land was tucked off a dirt road that barely showed up on GPS. The last turnoff was a rutted trail behind a row of thick pine trees. I had to park my truck halfway up the trail most days because the mud got too deep. By late October, the foundation was ready. I was building it with a post and beam frame, setting 6 by 6 posts 3 feet into the ground with concrete around the base. It wasn't going to be a big place, just a 10 by 12 foot rectangle with a sloped roof, 1 window, and a door I salvaged from a burned out farmhouse on the edge of Saline County. The plan was to get the walls and roof framed over the weekend and sleep there once the tarp was up, just to test it. I picked a bad weekend. It started raining around noon that Saturday. I knew it would rain eventually. October in Arkansas always brings surprises, but I wasn't expecting the sky to open up like it did. I'd already hauled most of the materials in by then, and the floor joists were in place, so I figured I'd keep going. I had my gear, a thermos of hot coffee, a tarp for temporary cover, and my truck parked down the trail just in case. The rain started slow, little taps on the tarp I'd strung between 2 trees. The sound was relaxing at first. I kept hammering away, measuring and cutting 2x4s for the wall frames under the tarp, stepping out between the trees every now and then to position something or recheck a level. The ground started turning soft fast. By 3 in the afternoon, it was basically mud soup all around the worksite. I should have packed up and headed home right then, but I was stubborn, and I'd been looking forward to this weekend for months. I told myself I'd at least finish 1 wall and secure the tarp better so I could sleep there. Around dusk, the rain picked up hard, the kind of rain that makes it hard to hear yourself think. I backed off the build, took my boots off, sat on a bucket under the tarp, and started eating a cold sandwich I'd brought. I remember the soggy bread and the smell of wet pine needles. The wind started to push through the trees and snap the edges of the tarp. I tied it tighter, but one corner kept slipping loose. There was something off about that night. It wasn't just the weather, it was the silence between the wind gusts, like the woods were holding their breath. I've camped alone dozens of times. I know what it sounds like when raccoons or deer move through underbrush, but this time it felt like something was watching. Not moving, just watching. I kept glancing toward the edge of the trees, where the light from my lantern stopped. The shadows didn't move, but they felt thicker than normal. I brushed it off as nerves and tried to stay focused. By 9 p.m., I gave up working. My clothes were damp, and my back ached from crouching under the tarp. I laid out my sleeping bag on a raised platform I'd set with leftover plywood, figuring it would keep me dry. I had my old .22 rifle near my bag. Not loaded, just a habit from growing up around wildlife. I didn't plan on needing it. Sleep didn't come easy. Every sound outside the tarp pulled my attention. The rain tapping, branches creaking, the far-off snap of wood. I kept telling myself it was just the forest, the wind, the weight of water dropping off limbs. But at one point, I heard something closer, much closer, a squish of wet ground. One slow step. I sat up, didn't move for what felt like 5 minutes. Just sat there in the dark, my hands slowly reaching for the rifle. I didn't load it, I just held it. The tarp flapped again, and I saw the silhouette of one of the trees against the sky. Nothing else, but my chest was tight. I knew I heard something. I sat up most of the night like that, dozing for 10 minutes, waking to every tiny sound. Sometime around 3 a.m., I heard it again. Not one step, multiple, slower this time, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. It was too dark to see past the edge of the tarp, and the lantern had burned out. I had a flashlight, but I didn't want to flick it on. If something or someone was out there, I didn't want to give away my exact spot. I stayed frozen in place, my heart thumping in my ears. I could feel it beating against the tight chest of my rain-soaked jacket. Then the sound stopped. Nothing, just rain again. I laid back down eventually, but I didn't sleep at all. Every time I started to close my eyes, I imagined someone standing just beyond the edge of the tarp, watching me, just out of sight. When daylight finally started to creep through the trees, I felt a little better. The rain hadn't let up, but the light gave me enough courage to move around. I packed my sleeping bag, checked the muddy path around the build site, and that's when I saw the prints. They weren't boot prints, not work boots, more like worn-out sneakers, and they weren't mine. I wear heavy tread, always have, and these were smoother, almost flat-bottomed. Someone had walked around the far side of the platform, just once. A partial track here, another there, both shallow and washed out from the rain. But they were real. I wasn't imagining it. I stood there, just staring at them, water dripping off my jacket, my skin cold. I didn't know what to think. No houses nearby, no other cars on that trail. No one knew I was out there, and the property was posted with signs every 20 yards. This was deep woods. Whoever came out here either knew about the place already or was looking for something. I decided to leave. Took only what I could carry in one trip, my bag, my tools, the lantern, the rifle. Left the plywood and the frame behind. Hauled it all back to the truck through the mud. My boots sunk deep, and I had to pull my feet free every few steps. The whole way back, I kept turning around, scanning the trees. I didn't see anyone, but I didn't feel alone. Took me 3 weeks to go back. I brought a friend the next time, an old buddy from the lumber yard named Rick. He carried 2. We walked the property together in daylight. No new tracks. Some of the wood I left behind had been moved, though. Not stolen, just shifted like someone had tried to build something with it, then stopped. A couple of nails were scattered in the dirt. One board propped up against a tree like a seat. Rick said maybe it was just a hunter or a drifter passing through. I nodded, but I didn't believe it. I'd been around enough people to know when someone was just wandering versus watching. Whoever had been out there that night wasn't lost. They were quiet, careful. They circled the cabin in the rain and didn't try to take anything. That's not a drifter. That's someone testing how close they could get without waking me. I never spent another night out there alone. I did finish the cabin months later, but I always brought someone when I worked. We built it tighter, added a locking door and a solid wood stove. I even put motion lights up on solar panels, nothing fancy, just enough to scare anything off. But even now, years later, I don't sleep right in that place. It's not ghosts. It's not monsters. It's just knowing that in the middle of the woods, far from anyone who could help, someone came looking, and I never saw their face.